With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Technology. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Thrilled to have a new face on the program. Another one of our great Young Voices contributors, Eric Suarez, is with us. We're going to go back down south, talk about a little DC policy as it goes to one of our kind of frenemy countries right now, Venezuela, down in South America. Eric, how are you, my friend?
Great. Thank you for the invite.
Thrilled to have you. Here we go again. We understand that there are certain things that poke through all other politics and ideology. Gas prices is one of them. Gas prices go up. Whoever's in the government's going to get the blame for it. Everybody's mad. Everybody's happy. Doesn't matter. Gas is a lagging indicator, and there's all kinds of economics to go into gas prices. However, when the gas prices go up, whoever's in power has got to do something about it. Well, Joe Biden's in power. He's got to do something about it. But one of those somethings he's doing about it involves Venezuela, and it looks not only on the surface like a bad idea, long-term looks like it could be a very bad idea.
It is. Well, we have to analyze the whole situation with Joe Biden and why he decided to go to Venezuela in the first place. And it all starts with environmental issues. It all starts with environmental causes that Joe Biden has decided to put forward in his policy, especially his energy policy. At the beginning of his term, we saw how he immediately blocked the Keystone Pipeline, which was going to be a huge deal for U.S. energy and to keep gas prices low, to allow the U.S. to be independent on oil prices. And after that, just the worst thing that could have happened to his administration happened, which was the Ukraine war, which disrupted oil prices across the globe. So when you combine those two things and global oil prices go skyrocket, then you find the situation that we're in, and the situation that we were, especially the first 2 years of his administration, when gas prices went up like crazy. And when you're that desperate, when you see how this is affecting or how it affected the Biden administration, he had no other choice but to go look for Venezuela, which is known as a very oil-rich country, but also very known for its highly totalitarian human rights abuses and many other foreign policy that the U.S. usually rejects. But that's how Biden policy has been acting towards us in the last few years, and the main reason is oil.
Yeah, it's not unusual for us to do business with untoward characters abroad. Look, we've been tied up in the Middle East for many, many years, including several conflicts. I remember, I was there. We know that there's bad people that we have to do business with. For folks that just haven't maybe paid attention or aren't familiar, give us the lay of the land in Venezuela as it exists today. Nicolas Maduro, he had some choppy water a couple of years ago, but has since reconsolidated power. Looks like he's in a pretty solid position. However, the entire country is still suffering greatly under his dictatorship. Give folks the lay of the land of exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about Venezuela, the government, the dictatorship, and the people of Venezuela that are having to suffer under that, because you need that piece of the puzzle before you get to why the policy is good or bad, right?
Yes. Overall, Venezuela has been a country that has been under totalitarian rule over more than 20 years. I was born in 1999, already under the socialist regime of Hugo Chavez, that then was handpicked successor Nicolas Maduro. Throughout the years, you have seen a country that was very rich, very advanced compared to other Latin American countries, deeply collapse into economic, political, and human rights abuses. It has become a chaos. I remember in 2014, you could see around people getting food from garbage and eating from remains of food that went in the streets, going to open garbage cans across the city, just looking for food. It was a big state of desperation. And That's on the economic side. When you go to the political rights abuses, in 2014, in 2017, people went to the streets. They tried to peacefully look for change in the country, and they were faced with repression like we haven't seen in our continent in a long time. We saw young people my age and younger at the time killed, straight up murder by this regime that used not only tear gas and water trucks to just repress, but they also were filling their guns with, let's say, not conventional ammunition that resulted in the death of many people, especially young people who were the front line of those protests. And the ones who weren't killed, they were tortured for many years. So it is a very dark, let's say, situation. It's a dark country when it comes to human rights, and that same those actions led to the migration of more than 7 million people, which is like 25% of our country. Especially young people have migrated across the continent. So it is a very dangerous regime. It's a regime that doesn't care about human rights. It doesn't care about its people, and that's the partner that the administration has decided to make business with.
Yeah. Eric Suarez joining us. You're writing in Real Clear World. We're going to link to the entire piece. A lot of links in this piece, by the way. Make sure you click through all the links as well so you get the full background. Kind of the heart of your piece gets to something I want to talk about that, like, we mentioned the Middle East. Look, the House of Saud does really despicable things. They believe really bad things. They're not good people, the people that run Saudi Arabia. They know how to keep the oil flowing. You never question. In fact, the problem usually is they restrict it down so they can make more money off it. They know how to produce and put out oil. They're really good at it. One of the things you argue in your piece is, even if you got past the moral stuff, even if you got past the dictatorship and all the bad stuff that's happened in Venezuela, strictly on business terms, this doesn't make sense because they have production issues. They have not upgraded their infrastructure, especially in the last 20, 25 years as Chevron's really been restricted by the government. They can't get the outside in because of sanctions and things like that to upgrade and maintain the production facilities. They got all the oil in the world, but if you can't produce it, refine it, ship it, all that stuff, it's just a bunch of oil that's laying around. Talk about that aspect of it, because if you're talking about a business deal, which is what we're doing, we're cutting a business deal with them, they're not going to be a reliable partner on any facet.
Correct. They're not a reliable partner, and there's two main reasons for that. Especially, the first one is that the sanctions imposed on the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan production sector are based on their commitment to reduce human rights abuses, to reduce, to allow for more democratic reforms, and to allow for more freedom of speech on the streets. That was the logic in which the sanctions were imposed, to create that sense of change and enforce it by economic pressure. What President Biden is doing right now is trusting that the Venezuelan government will continue some reforms or some attempts of making reforms in the country. The logic is that because the Venezuelan government went into negotiating table with the opposition and is allowing, in between marks, free primary elections in the country, the sanctions are reducing, and now some flow of oil is coming into the market and being able to negotiate. But the reality is that long term, we know that the Venezuelan government will not adhere to those advances. The Venezuelan government already in the primary has been persecuting candidates. It has been pressuring its followers to promote death threats and to attack certain candidates on the race. We're seeing that freedom of speech hasn't improved. We have seen that human rights violations and tortures are still happening. So this policy, even on a let's say trust basis between the U.S. and a commitment of change, has no future at all. So that's one of the main issues with this policy. And the second one, as you mentioned, is the production part. Venezuela is a country that its socialist policies has destroyed completely the production area, the oil production. We used to produce more than, I believe, 3 million barrels of oil per day, and now we don't produce even half of that. We don't produce even a quarter of that, even, I could say. And the main problem with that is that if you want to believe that you can revamp the oil sector in Venezuela, and the sanctions will not, removing the sanctions will allow from the oil production to increase. That's not understanding the situation in Venezuela. That's not understanding the damage that has been caused by 20 years of socialist policies to the oil sector, and not understanding that the ones who are controlling the oil in Venezuela right now are the Iranians. So you're inviting you're even funding more, not only a very dangerous ally in Latin America, you're funding one of your major enemies in the Middle East. Venezuela is so desperate to revamp its oil production that it has hired Iranian companies and has sold some of their plants to the Iranian government, which is something very dangerous for a region, but it's also very dangerous for the U.S. to depend on if we want to keep oil prices down.
Eric Suarez joining us. You just mentioned it. Let's talk about it. The criticism of U.S. policy towards Venezuela. Look, this isn't used. We've heard it towards Cuba for years and other things. It's like, well, of course they're having trouble because we're sanctioning them. And of course they're turning to Iran and Russia and these untoward actors because we're sanctioning them to stop sanctioning them. It's a chicken and the egg argument. You have a dictatorship that's doing bad things, so you sanction them, and then they claim the sanctions is the root cause of all their problems and American imperialism, this, that, and the other. How do we parse through that argument? Because you've heard that all your life, quite literally in your case, because you're a young guy. You've heard this all your life. Well, it's all America's fault. It's all the sanctions' fault. Yes, the sanctions have cause. How do we unglue that ball a little bit, do you think?
Well, first you have to understand the base of the sanctions and understand also the timeline of Venezuelan collapse. I feel like once you know those two things, you already can make your own judgment, and that judgment is going to logically end that the sanctions did not cause Venezuela's collapse. So let's say the major economic decline in Venezuela started in 2013, 2014. By that time, sanctions imposed by the U.S. weren't imposed on the economic sector, weren't imposed in the production sectors of the country. They were imposed on certain individuals. For example, dictator Nicolas Maduro wasn't able to travel or have actives or have any kind of investment in the U.S., clearly because he was a sanctioned person. And many people around let's say, the leadership of the regime were also sanctioned by that time. The real sanctions imposed on the production sector came many years later by the Trump administration. So the previous sanctions, let's say the personal sanctions, were imposed by the Obama administration and many administrations before. They were very common. But the other, the more aggressive, if you want to call them like that, sanctions were imposed by the Trump administration. By that time that the Trump administration had already imposed those sanctions, Venezuela was already experiencing a high decline in its economy. So when you put those factors next to each other and you check the timeline, you cannot argue logically that the sanctions were the main cause for Venezuela's economic decline, because that's a lie, and that's something that is completely disproven. And second of all, the oil production sector has been collapsing in Venezuela way before the sanctions imposed on the oil sector. And when you read and analyze what the main reasons for the sanctions were put on the economic sector in the first place, you can see that the Venezuelan regime has been using the oil production sector to first finance war equipment, to finance repression equipment, to finance human rights violations, and to finance themselves through corruption. So none of that money was actually benefiting the people. It wasn't benefiting it wasn't funding any positive, let's say, program inside Venezuela like socialists claim. And the sanction, and you can see the result of that, because when imposed the sanctions, Venezuela did not collapse even more. In fact, after the sanctions were imposed, you could see that other sectors developed because the money laundry machine that Venezuela is had to find another source of revenue. So that's a very interesting fact that happened during those times. So when you know these two things and you know this timeline, you have to logically argue or come to the conclusion that in the end, the sanctions did not affect Venezuelan people. It did not affect the Venezuelan people. It affected the Venezuelan regime officials. It affected the regime, and it stopped, and it put them in such a dangerous position that they had to, especially from 2016 to 2020, allow the figure of Juan Guaido to be protected by the U.S., and they have to comply with U.S. policy, and they were on the, let's call it, they were under the mercy of the U.S., if you want to say it in something like that way.
Yeah, Eric Suarez joining us. Okay, we talked about that. This is a deal. The Biden administration, for all practical purposes, have cut a deal with Venezuela. What did we get? What did they get? Break down the actual particulars of this specific transaction, because some of the things we gave them kind of raised a few eyebrows, and some of the things we're getting back raised some eyebrows.
It raises a lot of eyebrows, and it raises a lot of concerns, especially deep concerns, because I feel this is one of the worst deals that the U.S. has ever made, that I remember. Just for context, this deal wasn't just one meeting, one deal kind of situation. It was several meetings that have been happening through many months, almost a whole year, and that have been resulting in different outcomes. The first one was the exchange of two of Nicolas Maduro's cousins that were here in the U.S. withheld over drug trafficking charges. They were convicted, and they were prosecuted and convicted. We gave the first meeting traded them with some U.S. citizens that were in Venezuela, also in jail. Some oil businessmen that were over there. That was very interesting, because that was the first time the U.S. broke its policy of dealing directly and recognizing the interim government of Juan Guaido as part of the Venezuelan government. And the second part is that when the oil prices started going up across the globe due to the Ukraine war, and the oil supply in the world was going down, the sanctions were lifted, and Venezuela was able to negotiate with other countries as well. The main company in the U.S. started negotiating and got lifted and got allowed to negotiate with Venezuela was Chevron. And this allowed Venezuela to start regaining some ground that it had lost, some revenue that it had lost through the years. And at the end of the day, what ended up resulting from this deal has been, up till now, that the interim government of Juan Guaido has completely disbanded and disappeared. Venezuela and the U.S. are negotiating basically on that the U.S. trusts that Venezuela will really adhere to their openness and to the democratic changes that they have. And what the U.S. gets, it's more oil supply. That it's a very weird deal, because if you're negotiating with somebody, you expect equal, let's say, to have the equal leverage. And what I'm seeing from this negotiation is that Maduro is gaining a lot of ground, and the U.S. is running solely that Maduro will keep its word, which is something that should not be, that is not sound policy, and it's definitely not a sound agreement. You're dealing with a human rights abuser. You're dealing with a dictator. You're dealing with somebody who has no interest in losing power. And the deal is that he will allow reforms that will eventually lead him to lose his power. So this is not a sound agreement. This makes no sense at all. But that's the current situation that the U.S. is dealing with Venezuela at this moment.
Eric Suarez joining us. There's not a lot the U.S. can do other than outside pressure. And Maduro, again, he came a little close maybe a few years ago. He's kind of consolidated the power back down now. It doesn't look like he's going anywhere. What do you actually do with U.S. policy with something like this? Again, it's not unusual to have to deal with dictators. We deal with them in China. We deal with them in the Middle East. We deal with them also in Venezuela in this case. What do we actually do about it other than just watch it from afar? Obviously, there's some things we're doing. We just saw in the news where, we're going to let more Venezuelan immigrants into the country under special protection, that sort of stuff. But that's really small beer when you consider the enormity of the issues in Venezuela, because Venezuela has spilled out into the surrounding countries in South America. Part of the immigration problem and the migration problem that gets to the southern border, a lot of those are Venezuelans right now. This is a problem for the hemisphere and really the wider world. What should they be doing? Because economic pressure alone isn't going to change a dictatorship that this is ingrained, is it?
No, I believe that pressure from one country alone will not change, even from the mighty U.S., if you want to say it like that, it will not change most, especially because Venezuela still has very important allies like China. It has the aid of Iran. It has the aid of Russia. There's a big network of countries that align better with Venezuela than with the U.S., and that Venezuela has always been very helpful for them in the matter of resources. So it's an important piece for their advancements. And even with pressure from the U.S., economic pressure from the U.S., it will not really help to bring down the Maduro regime. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that the U.S. pressure is not important. And that's one of my main criticisms with the Biden administration, is that they're making it easier for the regime by reducing sanctions, by negotiating with them, by treating them like a regime that does not commit human rights abuses and does not deal with, has not tortured in the past U.S. citizens. And that's a very dangerous precedent. That's something that the U.S. should not be allowing itself. It should be more strong in its stance, and the deals, be way more careful with the deals that we made with Venezuela. And the second thing that what we should do to deal with dictators like that is, first, it cannot be done by one country. The U.S. needs to start finding cooperation with different countries in Latin America. The U.S. needs to focus more to find its allies in Latin America to coordinate actions against Venezuela and other allies of Venezuela around the region. Because it's not only Venezuela either. We have Cuba, we have Nicaragua, we have other countries in the region that have been aiding the Venezuelan cause in their dictatorship for years. We now see Mexico with López Obrador, who is a very big supporter of both Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua. So those things are very dangerous. Right now, it's a very difficult time to really take action in Venezuela, because the whole region has shifted left very drastically, and we see many governments in the region that are pro-left, pro-Maduro, and the ones who are the least aren't opposed enough to really impose a change in the region and try to pressure them. But definitely what the U.S. is doing is not helping the situation. Instead of putting more pressure and making it hard for Maduro to expand and to regain power and to regain the confidence of the regime, because at the end of the day, the regime starts down in itself, it will collapse by itself. What this administration has done is to give the power back and the confidence back, and revenue back to the regime to keep going forward. And in my opinion, this has been a big backtrack on the policy that Venezuela that the U.S. has been having. So while economic sanctions are not enough, and there is really a need to act as a region in cooperation, reducing sanctions because it's not the right time right now to make those policies as a whole is not an excuse. And definitely making the deals that the U.S. is making right now with Venezuela is not even an action to keep the governments in line, to keep the regime in line. It's just feeding more and more into the government and into the regime. And more years of this policy, if this policy continues, I feel that Venezuela could become a big danger in the region.
Yeah, Eric Suarez, I think you touched on something really important. So let me ask you the bigger question as we go forward when it comes to Venezuela, because, and this is bigger than the Biden administration or the Trump administration, because this is more of a generational problem. Your cohort, the rising generation, you just talked about it. There's a lot of a leftward shift. There's a shift back towards strongmen that we haven't seen since the 70s and 80s. And we know how that went in the 70s in some countries like Chile and other places. It did not go well. Even Argentina, if you go back far enough, it doesn't work out well. How much of that, what's the attitude towards America? Because frankly, there's not a lot of appetite in America for foreign policy right now, across the board, both sides, both parties. There's, their focus is elsewhere. We've got internal troubles. Of course, you already mentioned, Ukraine and the war with Russia's invasion there. America just hasn't paid attention to South America and Latin America a whole lot in the last 20, 25 years or so, other than a few specific issues. How has that changed how we are perceived, the country America, by that rising cohort, your peers down south? Because I think that has a lot to do with that, doesn't it?
It does, and that's something that we can analyze historically. I believe that the last, let's say, government or administration that tried to do something and had like an idea or proposals that deal with Latin America was Bush with the with the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, which was his proposal back in the 2000s, I believe. But that was a very wrong time to do it, or not wrong, but unfortunate time to propose and to have a very important plan for the region, because it was also the rise of Hugo Chavez, which was a very powerful figure in Latin American history. Love him or hate him, I really dislike him, as you may know, as most Venezuelans, but Hugo Chavez was a very important figure in the history of Latin America as a whole. We haven't seen a shift or such a popular figure in the region since Fidel Castro. And when such a figure appears, and such figure is so radical and so left-leaning, it has a generational impact. I was born in 1999 when he first got into power. And since that moment, you have seen how generations of Venezuelans that grew up with him, especially in Venezuela, see him as a figure like you could compare with the Republican Party, like people see Reagan. It's that figure of he was our leader. He was the man that represented the good change in the country. Even if they're wrong, that's how they see it. And outside of Venezuela, he's highly appreciated and highly respected by many people as well, especially from the left. And when you come with that, and after generations and seeing everything that has been going on in Venezuela, and the lack of U.S. involvement in the region has resulted in a huge shift in Latin America in the recent years. We now see that there's many governments that support a line of thought very similar to Maduro in the region. We saw in Peru with Pedro Castillo, who was a literal Marxist, win elections a few years ago. We saw Gustavo Petro, which is very left-leaning. He was part of a guerrilla in Colombia, also win power, left-wing guerrilla. We see Lula da Silva, who has been a long-time ally from the Venezuelan regime, gain power in Brazil. We have seen the Kirchners win power in Argentina again. We now see AMLO, López Obrador in Mexico, who has been a clear ally from the regime win power in Mexico. We have seen a whole new generation of left-wing governments rise up, and that's a combination from the figure of Hugo Chavez and the lack of a U.S. plan for the region. The U.S. has been isolating itself from South America. I don't think there is a plan about South America, and I think that the policies imposed in Latin America from the U.S. or the approach that the U.S. has taken on Latin America has been more reactive than proactive. You don't see a plan, you don't see a guideline, you don't know what to do, how to navigate it. You don't see an end goal. You see a lot of reactions to what's going on, and that's very dangerous. And the result of that is a region that no longer considers you a leader, that no longer pays attention or cooperates with you, that has been isolating from you again. And when it comes to politics and when it comes to cooperation, that's terrible, and that's the result of an isolationist foreign policy from the U.S. or not isolationist, but removing itself from Latin America and from their regional politics.
Yeah, the thing with foreign policy is it has to be consistent and it has to be coherent. And America is not good at either one of those for quite a while now. Eric Suarez, this has been a fantastic conversation. We'll definitely be having you back. We're going to link to his whole piece in Real Clear World on the Venezuelan oil deal. Make sure you read that. Let folks know where they can keep up with you and how they can follow you until we get you back on the show again, my friend.
Yeah, my handle in both Twitter and Instagram is @EricSuarezN. So that's it.
Simple. We got to work on your branding because you got good stuff. We got to get you some stuff. Maybe get you some merchandise, something. Eric Suarez,
Thank you.
One of our great Young Voices contributor. Outstanding job. Great insight. We'll talk again soon, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from MonsterCat.com.
Somos la máquina.
Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to the District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played. Folks, you've heard of Ethan Brown on the Heard Tell show a couple of different times, but if you're interested in learning about how to discuss things like climate change without all the politics and doom and gloom, head over to his podcast, The Sweaty Penguin. Sweaty Penguin is a late-night comedy-style climate podcast working to add nuance, critical thinking, humor, and hope to the climate conversation. They got over 100 episodes already, breaking down weekly news stories and specific topics, from the vanilla to the ADHD to the international accountability to orangutans. Yes, I know, that's a comedy thing, so just go with it. But each time, exploring different ways we can make progress on these issues while still helping the economy, health, security, and everything else we care about. Feel overwhelmed, exhausted, or excluded by today's climate change discourse? This is the podcast for you. Find The Sweaty Penguin wherever you get your podcasts or at www.thesweatypenguin.com.